Well, I must say, they dropped this album at exactly the right time. Only a few more days until Halloween, and I couldn't think of a better album to listen to at this time, so let's dive into it. Vector by Haken. So at this point, Haken doesn't really need too much of an introduction. They got their start in the very late 2000s, coming in at their first album for 2010 of Aquarius, and Aquarius hit the ground running. Like, it was the standard for a lot of progressive metal to come. And after that, they had hit after magnificent hit after... it was alright. And I mean, I will even go out on a limb and say that Affinity is my least favorite work of theirs. They still have some magnificent moments on the album, but as an album overall, it just wasn't... there was a lot of... it was weird. It was weird. So I wasn't as excited for Vector as I had for Affinity. And I think that played a lot to its advantage. I mean, Affinity had a lot to live up for, with works as The Mountain Visions and Aquarius leading the pack. And so I think this allowed the band to kind of stretch their legs and try something new. And right from the get-go, this album is very, very unique in the discography of Haken. This album has a fully fleshed out identity. This album has personality as well. We knew going into it that Haken had decided to try a much heavier tone of music, and that is felt. Like, this album is probably the heaviest, consecutively heaviest album that the band has put out. There's very little low points on this album. I think the word that I would prescribe to this album, using the terminology of this album, is gothic. This album is extremely gothic, and more in a modern gothic. We don't have those sweeping castles. We do have the gothic in terms of the atmosphere within the lyrics, terms such as lightning bolts, and that's found within The Good Doctor, Host, and even The Puzzle Box. We have, the darkness within the veils, and even some of the settings that these songs produce. The Good Doctor being that kind of medical gothic, especially with this like experimentation, and that's like a very good analogy for this album overall, is this kind of a medical horror, this medical gothic. And this is not only just found on the lyric and tone of the album, but also on the instrumentations used on this album. And I want to specifically call out Diego for doing this. His work within the synthesizers and the soundscapes that he's using harness and hone that type of gothic ambiance, especially within like the classical like 30s and 40s like black and white horror films. Like, we're talking like the original Dracula. You've got like the sliding bar of the keyboards that almost have like that woo, as well as having really deep organs permeating as well. Each of these add that extra little bit of flavor within that gothic tone that I just can't help but love. And even talking about this overall, I also want to talk about the structure of this album, because this is where the album has let's talk about it, because the structure is one of the things that I find the most interesting of this. I feel like this album has a definitive midpoint between Veil and Nil by Mouth. But this does start to fall short, because Clear opens up the album at being just under 2 minutes of being this really interesting gothic soundscape, really setting the stage with being like a blast of sound within this dark, very vivid corridor type of a thing. And then we go straight into The Good Doctor. But like these... I'd say the first 4 tracks of Clear, The Good Doctor, Puzzle Box, and Veil, they provide the first half of the album. And then from there we go on to the purely instrumental track of Nil by Mouth, Host, and A Cell Divides. Here is within the structure where I start to kind of falter a little bit. Because the album itself is a little bit on the short side, and I'll actually say that this works to its benefit, being just under 45 minutes. I think it's 44 minutes and 37 seconds. And being so short, at least comparatively to a lot of progressive metal albums out nowadays, it provides just enough to really get you into the music and really dive deep into the music, but not so much that you're like, whoa, I'm starting to tap out here. Like, I'm losing focus. I'm not quite sure where I am. So having this amount of individual tracks, and the track lengths being what they are, provides a great sit down, really quick feel for the album. This is where the album, for me at least, starts to lose a little bit of points. And I think this is the only place where the album will lose points is, I feel like, and I'll talk about this right now just to get it out of the way, I feel like A Cell Divides, the last track on this album, doesn't feel like a closing track, and I don't feel like this album really has a definitive end. I feel like this isn't quite as symmetrical with Clear starting the album, and we have a very clear beginning, but we don't have a definitive end, and I don't know if this was because of that concept of that gothic or that horror aspect of the horror not really ever having an end and being like cut off so short. But I craved that closing piece. And I don't think, as amazing as a track of Cell Divides is, it's not a closing track. So that's the only real knock against the album that I have. Each track itself is a mini epic. And I feel like the band has taken a step back from those really big, bombastic, overblown tracks and really like focused their efforts in controlling their sound, making it much more punctual and much more dynamic, while really tightening up everything. I've already talked about Clear. The Good Doctor, I was surprised with just how short it was, considering the scope of music that's found within it. The flow within these tracks, The Good Doctor and Puzzle Box in particular, are fantastic. Like, I'm following along. There's no real misstep. Everything is placed right in its proper place. I feel like the interplay between the guitars and the keyboards play magnificently. Like, we don't have a whole lot of like really long keyboard or guitar solos like we did within the past works. They're all playing together pretty much at the same time as well. And Puzzle Box probably hands down is my favorite track off of this album. I'll go on a limb, saying it right now, hands down, by leagues, is it my favorite track. I love how they set this song up, and this is a true epic track at being such a condensed like runtime. I was surprised at just how much they were able to do in less than 8 minutes. The build up, the payoff, when we get into that little playing style where it's like, it sounds like the puzzle box is almost trying to solve itself. This is what I thought the Nomads were supposed to represent within Dream Theater's last album of The Astonishing. Like, this was what I was craving out of that album, and it never produced. And this track, within only 7 minutes, provided exactly what I was hoping for within that grand 2+ hours album. After we get into that, over complex, lots of soundscapes of the puzzle box trying to solve itself, it starts to reprise the theme. It starts to build itself back up. And as it's building itself up, you hear the theme reprise, and it's reprising within the buildup. So you knew it was coming. And so when it finally like reverts back into the climax of the original like theme, you're already into it. And it's almost at that point, I'm like, oh, come on, guys, this is too much. And then after they, you do the, how can truth set you free when all we have are lies? How can time heal all wounds when time is running out and we're ending our days? They do those 2 bars, and then when they go into the second round of those bars, they have those arpeggios going over top, and at that point, I'm like, guys, come on. That's just cheating. That's not fair. How am I not going to love this track when you're putting this over top of it? Like, of course I'm going to gush. Now, Veil is a very interesting track in that for the longest time, I thought this was 2 pieces. I thought the first 7 minutes was one track, and then the last 5 minutes or so was the next track. I won't necessarily say that Veil was the first like disappointment track, but it is the first kind of breather track of not being as bombastic and heavy hitting and like brutal. They take that break, and then when they start to build up, it reminds me of like the very somber moments from Damnation from Opeth. That synthesizer, it feels right off of the last track off of Damnation, and slowly building itself up as well. And I feel like this is one of the first times where we really feel the influences. You can definitely feel the Dream Theater. You can definitely feel the Opeth on this track. And the build-up is still quite good. But for a 12+ plus minute track. I feel like this track might be the weakest track off the album, even though it is the longest track. And then from there we go into the purely instrumental Nil by Mouth. And Nil by Mouth is easily my second favorite. This reminds me of the second last track off of Hand Cannot Erase from Steven Wilson, where we have almost like this gent core aspect of this song where things don't feel quite right throughout the entirety of the instrumental. Things are either going too fast or too slow, almost like an old movie where things are slowing down and really speed up to catch up with itself. The big climax of this, it gushes of how dark, how sinister it is. And for, I think they're only second or third purely instrumental track, it really hits hard. The last two tracks mirror my feelings with Veil in being very strong tracks, but just not maintaining that same oomph that I felt from The Good Doctor and Puzzle Box. Both Host and A Cell Divide do fantastic jobs of what they have. Host being one of the few like somber moments on the album, and A Cell Divide being probably my third favorite track, but I gotta admit, this is probably the best song Leprous never wrote, because it is almost a carbon copy Leprous track. Just within the playing styles of having that really gent drop throughout the track, and Ross on the vocals really channeling the Leprous singer of having that like having those really drawn out moments that Leprous is like signature sound and known for. And so I felt like because they hugged their influences so tightly, it didn't feel completely like a Haken track, and it felt more like a Leprous track. Now, I'm not going to knock points out of it because it is still a friggin' amazing track, but I will knock points because it is the last track, and I've already mentioned why it doesn't really feel like an ending. Overall, this album really impressed me, and I think it just had to do with the fact that I didn't listen to any of the music leading up to this album. I wanted to go into it completely fresh, and I think that, as well as not having such a high expectations that I had with, say, Affinity, I think that all of those factors, and it being released so close to Halloween with such a dark moment, like this was released at the perfect time of the year for this. All those working together produced a fantastic musical experience for me. And I have listened to nothing else since Friday, to the point where, like, right after I've listened to it, I go back and I listen to it like probably 3 times in a row before I move to something else. Overall, this album blew me away. It's probably my favorite metal album for the past 3 or 4 years. This is probably the strongest metal album that I've heard. I keep fluctuating back and forth as to what rating I want to give it. When I first listened to this album, I was blown away and I was gushing, and the more I listened to it, I started to come down a little bit and I started to see some of the flaws, but the more I'm listening to it, the more that it's building itself back up again and starting to redeem itself. For the longest time, I was going to say just pick this up in physical format, but because I see that this album is going to be one that I put on repeat because it's so solid and it's got such a clear identity, I gotta say, I love this album with my whole heart. This is a fantastic piece. I haven't gotten bored, even though I've given this up to more than 15 listens to within the past 3 days. So that's gotta say something. So that's about it for Vector from Haken. What did you guys think? I know this is going to be a long review, but I had a lot to say. Let me know of your own points about this by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.